As I'm sure most of you watching this video know, it is very enjoyable to talk about the Terraria boss fights. In particular, it's very fun to talk about which ones are difficult and which ones aren't. So, I'm here with this little tier list right here, and I'm going to be telling you how difficult every boss fight in Terraria is. Starting off right here is King Slime. Not much to talk about with this boss fight. Everybody kinda knows it's a joke. King Slime is a very easy boss fight because he only has about, one attack? He jumps and he summons some slimes, and that's about it. There's no complication to this boss fight, very little to dodge. Even when he does hit you, he doesn't do that much damage, so he's going in the no-brainer tier. The Eye of Cthulhu is in a pretty similar spot as well. He only has 2 attacks. One of them is charging at you, and the other one is summoning eyes to fight you. Although I will say his expert mode fight is a lot more challenging, but at the end of the day, Eye of Cthulhu is extremely easy to dodge. He doesn't have that much health, and he choreographs all of his attacks. It's very easy to get in a rhythm with this guy. He's not quite as difficult as King Slime, but he's still pretty easy. Eater of Worlds is a little bit more difficult than the Eye of Cthulhu or King Slime, but the problem with the Eater of Worlds is that he's very easy to cheese. Because he's made of so many different parts which all have essentially no health, it's very easy to destroy this guy if you have any weapons that can attack multiple enemies. So for example, Jester arrows are a very common strategy to destroy the Eater of Worlds, and that's because they pierce through attacks. Any piercing weapon in general is going to do crazy damage to the Eater of Worlds and get rid of any challenge that you otherwise would have had. If you're not using piercing weapons, it is a little bit more challenging to fight the Eater of Worlds, but once again, he's a pretty uncomplicated boss fight, so I'm going to put him in easy. Moving on to the Eater of Worlds counterpart, the Brain of Cthulhu, I would say that this boss fight is a little bit more complicated. I don't know if it necessarily has more attacks, but at least to me it's always felt like there are more. The problem with the Brain of Cthulhu is that he moves extremely slowly even in the beginning, and even later in the fight, once you start hitting him with a fast weapon, he takes so much knockback that he's never going to be able to reach you. It's about as easy as the Eye of Cthulhu, I think. Next up is my boy Skeletron. I'm gonna be quite frank with you guys, really every single pre-hard mode boss in Terraria is not gonna be in the pretty hard or very difficult tier, just because, let's be real, I mean, it's pre-hard mode, it's not that difficult. But I would say that Skeletron's a little bit more challenging than any of the boss fights mentioned previously. It's the only boss fight in Terraria, pre-hard mode at least, that is split up into 3 different parts, and that does make it a little more complicated, especially if you're a new player who doesn't really know what you're doing. His attacks are a little bit more unpredictable than the likes of King Slime or Eye of Cthulhu, but the problem is his attacks barely do any damage, and he has no projectiles unless you're playing in expert or master mode. So I would come close to putting him in the challenging tier. I don't think he's that easy, but he's still pretty easy. Next up is my boy, or I guess my girl, Queen Bee. The problem with the Queen Bee is that it really depends when you fight this boss fight. You can fight it as early as the beginning of the game, and of course, you're gonna get destroyed, or you could fight it after Skeletron with dungeon gear, and in that case, you're gonna get an absolutely easy boss fight. There's gonna be no challenge. It's definitely a little more complicated than the likes of Skeletron, or any of the other bosses here for that matter, so I will still put it in the challenging tier, just because it's a little bit harder to get used to. Next up is the newest boss addition to all of Terraria, Deerclops. I don't really like this boss fight, but that's not really what's important. The reason I don't like this boss fight is because it's surprisingly unpredictable. One second he's gonna stomp the ground, and the other second he's gonna summon these weird hand things, and the next second he's doing something else. You really have no idea what Deerclops is gonna do next, and compared to all of the other pre-hard mode bosses, he is very unpredictable. Definitely harder than Queen Bee. I wouldn't say pretty hard, but he is a little unpredictable, so I'm gonna put him in challenge. Last but not least is the final pre-hard mode boss fight, which is the Wall of Flesh. This one is really dependent on your setup. If you have a bunch of potions in a very long arena, the Wall of Flesh isn't going to be too difficult because he doesn't do that much damage, and if you're using a ranged weapon, you're going to have a much better time than getting attacked by all of the hungry and the projectiles right next to it. But in a regular Terraria single player playthrough, I would say that he is a little bit challenging. Not quite as unpredictable as Deerclops, but a little bit harder than Queen Bee. Moving on, we have now got the Queen Slime, and I'm just gonna say it. I have no idea why Queen Slime is fought after the mech bosses. At least in my experience, especially in Expert and Master mode, Queen Slime has so many absurd projectiles and they do so much damage. The solution to Queen Slime is obviously building a giant arena. Once you've done that, it's not going to be too hard to fight this boss, but even then, I wouldn't say it's easy by any means. I'm going to put Queen Slime in the challenging tier. I think pretty hard might actually be more fair for this boss, but I don't know. It doesn't have enough health to be quite impossible or anything. Now we're going to be talking about the mechanical bosses, which is really the shift when Terraria bosses become more challenging and complicated. Starting off with the Destroyer, this boss fight has way more health than any of the other mechanical bosses. I think the Twins and Skeletron Prime have like 30 to 50,000 health, and the Destroyer has 80,000, nearly double. But the thing is, the Destroyer is very easy to attack. He can't really dodge your moves at all, and his probes drop health for you, so if you run low on health, you can just kill a few of the probes and collect their hearts. I wouldn't say he's easy, but I'll put him right around here. Anyway, moving on to an actually difficult mechanical boss fight, Skeletron Prime. In my opinion, and I know this might be crazy, Skeletron Prime by far is the most challenging mechanical boss fight. He may not send out as many projectiles as the Destroyer or the Twins, so he's not constantly barraging you with attacks in the same way, but the attacks that Skeletron Prime does, they do way more damage. I know the general consensus is that the Twins is the hardest mechanical boss fight, and we'll get to that in a second, but in my opinion, it is Skeletron Prime, and I'm going to put him in the pretty hard tier. Speaking of the Twins, let's now talk about the Twins. I get why a lot of people think the Twins is a difficult boss fight. They have much more attacks, they're faster, it requires a lot more multitasking, but here's the thing. The Twins' attacks really don't do that much damage. The only hard-hitting attack from the Twins is Spasmatism's second stage when he starts throwing out that flamethrower. On top of that, the attacks are actually very easy to eventually get used to and dodge. At first, it's kind of difficult to dodge the Twins' attacks, but after fighting them a few times, it definitely gets a lot more easy to adapt to them. I would say the Twins are harder than the Destroyer just because they are much faster and harder to hit, but I would not say they are nearly as challenging as Skeletron Prime, so I'm going to put them in the challenging tier. Next up, we've got our boy Plantero, the fan favorite boss fight of Terraria, and I will say, this boss fight is much harder than the mechanical bosses. With every other boss fight in Terraria, you can kind of pick out a weakness. You know, Skeletron Prime's a little slow and easy to dodge. Queen Slime, you just build a big arena and her attacks won't get to you. Wall of Flesh, again, just build a big arena. With Plantera, there isn't really an easy counter. I would argue that the second phase of Plantera is a lot easier than the first one, simply because, yeah, she goes a little bit faster, but she stops sending out her projectiles, and to me, that's always the hardest part of the boss fight. Dodging those annoying, stupid projectiles near the beginning and near the second phase, that's where Plantera always kills me. It's never the second stage. Plantera is not very difficult. She's still simple enough to beat in a few tries, even if you're completely new to the game, but she is definitely a little hard. Golem is going in no-brainer tier because that's a no-brainer. We all know why. Duke Fishron, the Macho Man, the goated Terraria boss fight. You may not remember this, but I do. Back in those 1.2 Terraria days when the final boss fight of the game was Golem, Duke Fishron was always seen as the true final boss of the game because he was just the hardest by far, which he still is. I mean, he's still harder than Golem, still harder than Plantera, obviously harder than the mech boss fights, and in general, he's a very challenging boss fight. He's extremely fast, extremely hard-hitting, his projectiles are very annoying to dodge, and this difficulty is only enhanced in Expert Mode and Master Mode when he has that insane third stage. I'm pretty sure he's the only boss fight in Terraria with a third stage, and this guy is undisputably in the very difficult tier. Speaking of bosses that are in the very difficult tier, Empress of Light. This boss fight has the highest variety of attacks in the entire game by far. There is no boss fight in Terraria that even comes close to having as many attacks as the Empress of Light. If you go too close to the Empress of Light, you're gonna get punished because of that stupid ray attack where she turns into a ball of death. But if you stay too far away from Empress of Light, you might get caught off guard because her projectiles come at you out of nowhere. In this boss fight, you really gotta prioritize dodging attacks and staying sharp at all times because there is absolutely no way you're gonna be able to tank your way through it, and I think everybody kind of knows that this boss fight is very difficult, arguably even more difficult than Duke Fishron. Now it's time to talk about the second to last boss fight in Terraria, the Lunatic Cultists. This boss fight totally sucks. But that's not what we're talking about here. It's honestly pretty hard. It's not the hardest in the game, but it's pretty hard and in the worst way possible. It's just a bunch of annoying projectiles constantly moving to different areas so you can never get a good look at him. Lunatic Cultist boss fight is very easy to get used to after a while because he actually only has a few attacks, but those few attacks have a lot of variety. They are pretty difficult to dodge and they do some pretty crazy damage at times. So the Lunatic Cultist is going in the pretty hard tier above Plantera. Last but not least, it's the final boss fight in the entire game, the Moon Lord. I don't know if this is just me, but I still struggle with the Moon Lord more than any other boss in Terraria. Moon Lord simply has so many projectiles flying around at a time and they're so unpredictable and hard to dodge that the boss fight is very difficult to fight, and the thing is, you can't really tank those attacks either because they do an absurd amount of damage. Obviously, you can use the nurse to cheese this boss fight, and honestly, that's what I do in most casual playthroughs, but if you're not using the nurse, it's gonna be a real tough time. Even though it's not quite as crazy as Empress of Light or Duke Fishron, I'm still gonna put the Moon Lord in the very difficult tier. So there you have it, this is the Terraria boss fight tier list based on difficulty. Obviously, like I said in the beginning, feel free to leave your comments disagreeing, but I have to go now because my dog won't stop barking and I can't even get a recording done.